Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to share with you about my research on what's driving the adoption of regenerative agriculture, a relational values approach to understanding food systems transitions. My name is Lee. I'm an assistant teaching professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I'm looking forward very much to sharing this information with you today. A little bit of a presentation roadmap. First, I'd like to share with you where this research is situated at the Science Policy and Practice interface. Next, a bit about what is regenerative agriculture and a rationale for the project, and then what are relational values in this approach, research questions and methods that relate to this, and in terms of results, some top fives and drivers for adoption, as well as the results, themes, and findings that build on those. To conclude, I'd like to share with you some insights for science policy and practice relative to that interface and what's next in the research process. So very briefly here, what is the science policy practice interface? It highlights how insights from practice can inform science and policy. We're very familiar with the science policy interface, but there's another layer in the systems transformation of how practices on the ground can filter through these kind of higher scale systems in order to influence change from the ground up and then again from the top down. Can be described as a system of feedback loops across scales of action, those higher to lower scales in terms of breadth of people or geography or time or landmass. And this interface and its potential to influence systems change are inspirations for this research and are a growing area of research of really connecting that grassroots practice and the knowledge there to science and policymaking. So diving right in, what is regenerative agriculture? Here's a hint. There's no perfect definition, and maybe there shouldn't be. There are processes of regenerative agriculture, such as how people go about grazing or working with land and soil, or there's outcomes saying, here's this particular result. A lot of practitioners connect to relationships with land and place and soil, but others have very widely different definitions. And so there are some general themes and characteristics. But in general, regenerative agriculture still has emerging definitions and definitions that move over time. And some of the arguments that are made in the research is that it doesn't matter what definition one holds as long as they're not just changing it along the way to conveniently meet results. To know one's definition, whether it's related to processes or outcomes or both, and to be clear on that as one is engaging in the practices. So what's the rationale for the project? Regenerative agriculture is an emerging set of practices and social configurations, as mentioned, such as action networks and holistic management. Action networks being a social configuration, holistic management being a specific practice. Regenerative ag practices are part of environmental policy initiatives already, such as the Project Drawdown, a major initiative that's trying to show the top ways that we can draw down CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. Environmental and economic factors are often primary in these contexts. So understanding the relational values guiding the adoption of regenerative ag may be important for policy, the values dimensions beyond environmental and economic factors. And the logos on the right are some examples of major organizations, many of which work very much out of the United States, but also globally, that are working on a range of definitions and social configurations for regenerative ag. But what are relational values beyond just typical values propositions? We often think about instrumental value, which is what's in it for me, and intrinsic value into the idea that nature has a good unto itself, beyond that human being, what is the utility value of it? And these are often looked at in a binary. Relational values sees a more systemic, co-creative, codependent, or mutually dependent relationship between people and place. And the idea that people, as you see in that little purple connective arrow, will have relationships with each other, and individuals will have maybe shared or separate relationships with place, and that has an entire system of values unto itself in terms of these relational dynamics and connections that are involved in a relational value system. So it's not just instrumental and intrinsic, but the system that emerges at the meeting places beyond those. So relational values link people and ecosystems via tangible and intangible relationships with nature, as well as the principles, virtues, and notions of a good life that may accompany these. And some examples include cultural identity with place, moral responsibility to non-humans, social responsibility via care for nature, and lifestyle and relationship with nature, or a good life associated with these. So the key research question building on all of these ideas in this paper is, how are relational values and economic and environmental factors altogether driving the adoption of regenerative agriculture? Methods and data collection and analysis methods. Did interviews with regenerative ag practitioners across the United States. So this is specific to that region, though that allows for an interesting comparative internationally. Used a snowball sampling approach, starting with my personal contacts and my colleagues' contacts at the Savory Global Network and Mad Agriculture, which also means that that is the particular slice of the regenerative agriculture movement that we ended up getting the most influence from in terms of this data. Collected 31 interviews in total, practitioners across, qualitatively coded the interview transcripts using MaxQDA and a range of qualitative techniques, first to identify key areas along the values, economic and environmental dimensions, and then to examine them and draw them together for more synthetic findings. And as noted, thematic coding to develop these results. So the spread of interviewees across the United States here was mostly in Colorado, because that was the combination of Mad Agriculture. Well, not mostly Colorado, I should say roughly a third in Colorado, based on the connections there. So focused in that region, but did get coverage across the United States. And I personally think that it's more significant that there was a slice from Mad Agriculture and the Savory Global Network in terms of potential values, environmental and economic dimensions, than the particular landscape across the US that was represented. And we are glad that we got this coverage from across the United States and got to look at these two particular slices from the movement. So what were some results? Top fives and themes here. In relational values, most common was social responsibility, followed up by a good life and generational eco-stewardship. Now, our relational values we drew from a very particular set from two papers that had identified particular relational values. So these were the interview protocols, which can be found in the paper, were much more open in terms of the questioning, but then when we coded them relational values wise, we were very specific to that particular basket of relational values. And so connectedness with nature, eco-focused stewardship, and social cohesion via nature were in order. This is percentages of interviewees that had seemed to mention this across the interview in some way, of social responsibility being a very important value, and then these other key top 5 values. The full are available in the paper and in the appendices there. Economic factors, profitability and livelihoods, stable livelihoods were the top and very close related aspects. But then these two elements of markets, marketing, and farmers markets, the idea of getting their goods out there as an economic source was very important. And then that correlation with productivity and yield, and the potential with regenerative agriculture of either increasing those or the struggles to maintain those relative to other values. Viability of regenerative agriculture was also a major one, and the economic viability of an entire farming project. Environmental factors. Soil and or land care. No surprise, very high, very tied into many of the ways people understand and define regenerative agriculture. Similarly to ecosystem well-being, that systemic relationship to soil and land care. Next, which was a little surprising, was animal welfare, and creating the about 50% named animal welfare as a major environmental factor for them in terms of the adoption for regenerative agriculture. Now, some have noted that animal welfare could easily be brought into other areas of a values dimension. In this case, we put this in environmental factors, but it could easily have been seen across dimensions. Then climate change and planetary well-being was important for many. And we want to highlight here that perspective of that big global perspective versus the hyper-local as it relates to soil and animal welfare. We also identified a whole range of additional factors that didn't seem to fit neatly into other categories. Top among these were health and healing, this desire to be personally healthy or have ecosystem health or global health, and then a general desire to just make things better, to see the future as being better than the present was a major motivator for many. Next was systems thinking and or holistic worldview. Many involved with regenerative agriculture of those we connected with really seem to have a sense of interconnectedness built into their worldview, which is not necessarily true for in terms of the way farmers or other environmentalists might think about these issues, though it might be common. This was very, very prevalent among these practitioners. And social ecological systems change was another major one in terms of this was relating to systems and making things better and change processes. There was also a really important feature of non-domination of nature or working with nature as a major part of regenerative agriculture and farming practice. Next up, we also identified a series of what we call synergies and tensions, was these kind of additional factors that also seem to be in their own category. So a synergy with regenerative ag and across various other dimensions and elements such as the economic, the values, the environmental, and these other factors was a potential mutual benefit and link with people in ecosystems. You can see that relational quality in there. Potential balance between economics and a worldview vision was big for a lot of people. This just wasn't just pie in the sky, and it wasn't just make ends meet. It was about that potential of having that good life alongside that economic stability as being important. But similarly, we saw these tensions. No surprise, a major one was the pushback against industrial agriculture, the kind of traditional factory farming models of agriculture as a major dynamic, and the social tensions that went on there as well in terms of people getting recognition for their work and being able to do their work in their communities with regenerative ag. We also had the future vision versus economic potential, which is in direct tension with this potential balance between economics and vision. The idea of people were putting a lot on the line to try to go for this regenerative agricultural transition. And it's very interesting as to why. And what we saw as one of the major explanatory features of that was privilege versus a lack of privilege, that there were some who had a lot of privilege to be able to make this transition and were generally doing things for a make the world better versus a lack of privilege for those who were trying to make ends meet or trying to save a family farm amidst degrading soils and a difficult agricultural system and extractive economic elements, that they were pushed to making these choices due to these relative extremes, and that they're putting a lot on the line of relative to this, the vision and the potential for economics versus the tension there as well. And so it's a very interesting thing to note that people are making a shift, perhaps because they feel they have to, either to achieve an ideal vision or to maintain a lifestyle that's important to them, or a combination of both. Very, very interesting and powerful factors here. So next up, we have what were the primary drivers that interviewers explicitly named as primary drivers? Health was right on top, and this was the primary interesting finding that we had of this relationship to health of people, soils, ecosystems, and planet were vital. Relational value at top was social responsibility, and these were just general primary drivers. It wasn't just the top in each category. This happened to have a good spread, which was very interesting. And so you see that lower percentage there because that's wasn't just that they named it at all, but that they named it specifically as a primary driver in an interview question. Soil and or land care, very high up. Profitability of economics. Now, it was interesting that this named as a lower primary driver, and we think that this wraps into all of these, and I'll just show you that last one on this list here. All of these wrap into that general sense of what does it mean to have health or live a good life? What is that relational quality of being connected to the world and living a good life, farming well, having the lifestyles that we want? So these were specifically named as primary drivers for adoption. And yet they amalgamate into this general healthy way of being and healthy life. And so some summary themes and findings. Improving the health of communities, ecosystems, and oneself or family was a primary driver for adoption. Examples, health or healing, as I showed. Being on a health journey was an example, or towards repairing the soil and communities. And in the context of health, people mentioning human health specifically, or mental health very specifically. Soil and or land care, soil health being a very specific term that was named relative to these. And generational eco-stewardship, leaving a legacy for my kids in the context of wanting them to have a healthy life and experience was really, really vital as a primary finding. Next was this one, as I mentioned moments ago, about relative economic privilege, correlated with the binary of privileged idealism and less privileged necessity. Privilege versus lack of privilege. Privilege to grow up in nearby nature or having another job. The idea of having these privileges of being close to nature or environment or needing to get another job in order to just maintain the lifestyle. Profitability, livelihoods, and viability. You have to earn enough to make it make sense. It's either a kind, this was a direct quote, it's either a kind of idealistic guiding light or people who are close to the cliff's edge. Really important and valuable finding. The potential balance between economics and the regenerative ag vision and that future vision and economic potential, that kind of tension or synergy aspect that come part of this. And we believe that this is one of the major drivers for transition and adoption, are those in these extremes being pulled to needing to change versus those in the middle that may not seem so much of a need to. Another was this obvious one of shifting away from industrial agriculture was a moral, economic, and environmental imperative. And for many, this idea that this shift of opposing the extractive paradigm was important and aligning that with social responsibility and eco-stewardship, feeding my community or the well-being of my family connected directly with these. And that my mission is to try and leave this place better than I found it also was directly connected of seeing this kind of bad guy or antagonist element going on with the industrial agriculture system, but also seeing regenerative ag as being a viable solution and theory of change and pathway to accomplishing that. Next, we found it very interesting that there was a capacity for systems thinking was a very common feature as an awareness among these practitioners, or interdependence with nature, that we think about ourselves and the whole system because we are part of the system, or this mutual benefit of acknowledging the balance returning to Earth in exchange for its resources, we are able to work toward regenerating our lands. We could see that mix of both intrinsic and the intrinsic value and the more utilitarian values in those elements of balancing those in that relational way of being a very interesting value proposition, but that systems thinking being a required element of that mindset to be able to make that choice. And again, non-domination over nature as being a very important part of this process of saying that we're an interdependent relationship with ecosystems and natural systems. Last but not least, highlighting several factors that are worthy of future study that were very interesting that we didn't dig into in more detail, but that were noted by practitioners. The teaching and learning about regenerative ag was a motivation for many, and many farms were also, and projects were also learning sites that people used. Farming is a difficult endeavor regardless of practice. No matter what people do, it is hard. And that is very important. It's not all roses or not easy, no matter how regenerative it is. It's very challenging. Many also mentioned social and ecological justice in one way or another as being vital and important to their work and essential to the regenerative movement as part of its identity, which there's a lot of research out there that has critiqued regenerative ag in this regards, and yet many practitioners feel it's a very important element. And this was unprompted. They brought this in. I didn't specifically ask about those topics. They brought that in as part of what is important to them. How that's operationalized may be another question, but it means that there's a lot more to explore there in regenerative ag. And also technology was sometimes used as a solution or a detriment to regenerate social ecological systems. So another a divergence there that could be worthy of exploration. And some also mentioned farming practice as a path to personal growth and the kind of evolution, internal evolution that can go on with that. Another very interesting area to explore that could relate to those achievings of a good life and maybe alleviating climate anxiety or other kind of major mental health struggles that we're facing today. So some insights for policy and practice going forward. Really exploring what this idea of health as a driver for adoption could mean for these and other agricultural practices. Exploring this privileged idealism and less privileged necessity dichotomies that are vital demographics to consider, and the way that the more extreme along the bell curve of potential adoptees might be some of the most interesting areas to engage with, and how to engage that more heavy middle of that bell curve. And that relational values may be very, very interesting for food systems policymaking and research, that the relational values elements of this research were very, very valuable to drawing out qualities that may have been difficult to see otherwise. Seems unlikely that that health component, for example, or the understanding of these ideals relative to privileged idealism, less privileged necessity, would have been drawn out as concretely if it weren't for those relational values dimensions. And that definitions of regenerative ag can and perhaps should include social factors, and that we need to consider these more carefully. So next for research is considering how specific social configurations such as networks or cooperatives, in this case like the Savory Global Network or Mad Agriculture, specifically influence adoption. We didn't examine specifically along the lines of those networks and had the interviewees in a pool, but there could be cross comparisons, and that can also allow room for a lot more inclusive kind of research that looked across other kinds of definitions and social configurations beyond the two that we primarily drew from. Expanding the demographic pool of practitioners, as I just mentioned, beyond these two networks, and exploring the influence of definitions and particular perspectives of definitions on the practice of regenerative agriculture and how that influences these things. So overall, deepening awareness of and potential for the full relational values in ag research, and seeing those possibilities and exploring those, and what can they draw out that other research may have missed or that can help reshape other research. And if you'd like to dig more deeply into all of this, this full paper is available and published right now through Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, and do hope you can engage with that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much for your time today. Really hope you enjoyed the presentation, and looking forward to connecting with you in the future.